This episode is about freedom of expression, the importance of being able to find and preserve information, and keep your information secure, especially online, whoever you are, wherever you are. A service that can help with that? NordVPN. You can learn more and try the NordVPN 2-year plan plus 4 months extra by going to nordvpn.com/moviebob or follow the link in the description, risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. NordVPN has tools to protect your data, secure your browsing, and let you see the whole World Wide Web, the way the internet was supposed to be. Click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/moviebob to get the NordVPN 2-year plan plus 4 months extra risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. And now, on to the show. Okay, and now part 2 of 2 for this. Let's not linger on a drawn-out intro since there's about a minute of previously on for context anyway, and if you didn't watch the first part, you should. It's kind of a package deal, but just to catch us all up, the point here is revisiting in deeper and hopefully more complete fashion a history episode from earlier in the show's run, and maybe do a better job than I did originally at the message and the meaning. Ended up running a little long, so we cut it in 2 with part 1 covering how things went down in history, and this part at least attempting to get to the what does this mean today business. So as to where we left off in that first part, music and fashion genre suddenly got mega popular in the 70s. There was an equally sudden backlash against it as the 80s rolled in that was conflated with a sense of politicized pop culture pivot against urbanite liberalism and other communities it was associated with and used as a straw man stand-in for. This happened not perhaps uncoincidentally in tandem with the mainstream awareness of the AIDS crisis ravaging these self-same communities, and doesn't this extremely broad and general description of a moment in history sound somewhat similar to the anti-wokeness backlash currently being foisted on popular culture by the modern political right, and how might victims of said backlash today learn from this history to survive it now? We now rejoin time being a flat circle already in progress. So not only did gay, urban, progressive culture dial itself back publicly, you had millions of people sick and dying as well, and that can't be minimized. Like, who knows what happens culturally to a moment in pop culture where the toe dipping in of mainstream middle-class white culture pulls back and says, oh, hey, you know, that version of maybe that's a little much for us was not immediately countered by literal plague. Who knows what else would have happened? Because that is a 1-2 knockout punch. And it almost feels, not even almost feels, it does feel grotesquely minimizing to even conflate or connect the two. Because it's not like, oh no, if only records hadn't been blown up somehow magically through karmic fate, this horrible disease epidemic would not have also risen alongside. This was a terrifying coincidence of events, and we'll just never know what might have been had the cultural forces that were pushed back against by the, oh, we don't like this in the form of disco moment, been able to regroup. Were they not doing triage and self-protection against a plague epidemic that the rest of culture was busy actively trying to ignore, if not exacerbate?
This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
And meanwhile, on the culture side, it was erasure happening. Erasure. Because for a moment, even outside of the large but still somewhat niche phenomenon that was the disco thing, late 70s pop culture was, for lack of other terminology, very queer, very diverse, and then the 80s mainstream pop culture was very white and also very undercover about how diverse and how, again, for lack of other terminology, very queer the preceding culture had been. You had mainstream rock acts, David Bowie, Mick Jagger, Queen, right there in the name of the band, very openly flouting gender norms, bisexuality, didn't put it all the way in the closet, but dialed it back into other forms. Kind of went, you know, pull it back, pull it back, pull it back. Kiss took the makeup off. Not that Kiss would ever be comfortable calling themselves part of, like, the queer era of 70s rock, but, like, Kiss taking the makeup off was probably part and parcel to the, no, rock can't even be a little bit queer now. So then elements of this had to become very undercover about it, filtered out in other ways. So that's where you see like glam metal, hair metal. There's elements of it peeking back out. Rob Halford famously bringing the studded leather bar look to metal, and noting that a lot of younger metal fans just did not even grasp that that's what that was. Dee Snider and Twisted Sister, enough said. Now, the 90s whiplash about this again, at least on racial lines. 90s pop culture is resurgently black in the way that 80s pop culture was resurgently white, particularly in music and fashion.
Black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all.
But the fact that it had to resurge at all was telling, and it was part of this. And that erasure of how black and how queer 70s culture was part of the disco sucks backlash, basically. And I don't think that that can be realistically denied. And again, it's not about whether you like this fucking music. I'm not a giant fan of this music. Hating or not hating the music was a stand-in for people for hating a cultural trend. And a less subtle, mask-off version of that is what I see in this anti-wokeness thing now. This meaningless word, the appropriation of what at one point was a proper description of something woke, diverse, whatever, is now a way to brand anything that is non-right-wing, non-conservative, traditional American, basically non-supportive of the Trump sucker agenda, whatever, as a way to brand that as the enemy and a thing to be against in culture war space. Is the similarity that I see between anti-wokeness and disco sucks.
Disco sucks!
You don't like the village people? They're not gonna shove it down our throats. We rock and rollers will resist, and we will triumph.
But we have to keep pushing, is the idea that women are victims in the United States. They're part of the victim coalition here in the United States, and you have to hear it from She-Hulk.
It's not going to be woke. There's no more woke in this country.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
In the same way that wokeness has nothing to do with anything real, disco sucks had nothing to do with disco music, other than as a safe, coded, cowardly way to be, I'm not a racist, I'm not a sexist, I'm not anti-gay, but way to be against people, groups, general concepts associated with a nickname for a kind of music or a buzzword for some vague political concept. And good God, I hope that that makes some sense, to the degree that anything about this very stupid cultural moment can make any sense. I hope I'm making it make sense. Because the fact that this feels so familiar to me in this moment sucks. Because the disco implosion and disco sucks, whatnot, lasted a while. And it was successful. And if you needed another bullseye reason this had to at least be initially 2 parts, this would basically be it. We're at about the 40-minute mark of the full picture here, and this right here is pretty much the Bob finally gets to the fucking point part. Like, the history is important, and I hope everyone found it interesting, entertaining, etc., but the real part I wanted to hammer home here, that I thought needed all that goddamn context, your mileage may vary, probably a bit of an ego trip now that I think about it, is the rest of this right here, because I feel like something even my crusty-ass generation had a really tough time coming to grips with is that the version of pop culture history and also history that we received when it came to cultural improvement and social revolution was very skewed by the boomer memory of 20th century history being the narrative, and that narrative being very self-congratulatory even while being self-critical, and also very incomplete when we received it, and that kind of left us unprepared to deal with a lot of what happened as we got older. That narrative being basically history began in the 1950s, which was bad because conformity, but then we, boomers, invented being teenagers, and we got angry about Nam and did women's liberation and civil rights, and a guy had a dream which cured racism, we're pretty sure, and then several other things happened, and yeah, mistakes were made, but then black president and gay weddings, you're welcome, so basically progress is a line that goes diagonally up forever at varying speeds, right? Right? And no, obviously not. Like, I'm not a pessimist or a doomer. In fact, I do think there actually is some basic history truism to the concept of the arc of history bending towards freedom, etc., etc., but it's definitely not a straight, clean arc. Sometimes the good guys lose, badly. Sometimes progress gets its ass kicked. Sometimes the Library of Alexandria burns. Sometimes the believers beat the thinkers. Sometimes the bad guys tear down the good things just because they can, and the good guys have to build things back from scratch, and it sucks. And as shitty as that is to hear, I think it's worse to deprive people of knowing that that can happen, because then they don't know what to do when it happens. And worse than that, they might think they can't overcome it because nobody ever told them that these battles have been fought back from and overcome before. That, yes, seeing what felt like big strides forward in acceptance and progress for this or that cause get pushed back or turned against hurts, but it's not unprecedented. Society doesn't move forward on a straight upward trajectory. It gets dragged up uneven steps, kicking and screaming like a disobedient, bratty fucking child that doesn't want to wash up before dinner, and sometimes it pulls free and falls back down the steps or drags you down with it, and you have to pull it back up again. And that sucks. That's a sucky fight to fight, but it is a fight that's been fought before. Other people have in fact come back from this kind of loss, and that means you can too. Not that it was a planned thing, but to the degree that this was a successful culture flip, an erasure of a moment in culture where American pop culture was trending in a more diverse direction and then folded back in on itself aggressively against the rapidity of a certain amount of change, lasted a while. And I am someone who grew up in the era of the post-Disco Sucks implosion. I was born in 1981 and grew up in the very, hey, it's morning again in America, let's get back to a very safe, comfortable, implicitly white suburban vision of things under Reaganism, under, hey, we went too far, everyone fucked too much, everyone rock and rolled too much, everyone did a bit too much blow, everyone had a bit too much fun, let's be less of that now. And as a child growing up in that, it did not really occur or come through to me until a little bit later just how much was lost to get the seeming safety and actual banality in which I'd grown up. I did not get to know how many people suffered and were harmed in order to, build the relative cushion of comfort in which I grew up in, and the fact that it wasn't actually that comfortable. And that a lot of the things that I grew up in, most of the good music and good art and cool stuff, were actually things that were built by the weirdos and the freaks and the cool guys who were purged before I got here. Sesame Street and the Muppets and all that were made by a bunch of hippies who were fucking hated and were being shoved out of their jobs and defunded by the Reagan administration. All of the ass-kicking rock and rollers and musicians of the 60s and whatnot that my parents loved, wrote the books of rock and roll and whatnot, they were hated by the government that came into power by the time I was a young kid. And yes, fine, I loved a bunch of, cool cartoons and whatnot that I got to grow up with because they deregulated a bunch of TV stuff. And okay, thank you, Ronald Reagan. I got to have Transformers on TV. I'm not sure it was worth invading Iran-Contra or whatnot. I'm not sure that's like the trade-off. So before somebody brings that up, fuck you.
Just remember, there's a thin line between being a hero and being a memory.
But it's also worth remembering in these moments of seeing culture change. And when I say culture change, I'm talking about the way mainstream culture adopts or chooses not to adopt broad cultural shifts. The mainstream culture picked up and put down the disco moment like a toy that it was sort of interested in and then discarded because it only ever cared about it as a bauble that it was sort of shiny and interesting and said, oh, hey, look at this new weird kind of music and these new different people that we haven't really paid attention for, but seem to be, spending a little bit of money, and the rich people in the suburbs suddenly seem to be sort of interested in this new form of sex, drugs, and rock and roll because we've maxed out the value proposition in the original sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So, okay, let's dwell on this for a while and make a kitschy, less good version of this, perhaps about a duck to put on the radio and sell a little bit more. Okay. And as soon as it was clear that there was only a certain amount of money to be made in this, they not only stopped, but turned against it and said, no, this is actually bad, and we're going back and we're going to rebrand rock radio as classic rock, and we're only going to play guitar rock by white guys now. And we're going to pretend that Eric Clapton invented anything. And I've always been a proponent of the idea that, well, people should be suspicious of rainbow washing, rainbow capitalism, whatever. It's also okay to enjoy it when it gets here because, hey, it means that right now you've won a certain amount of victory because, to a certain extent, you are seen as the target profitable thing, and that's good. That means that you have a certain amount of power to pull on, but it can be fleeting. And it can go away, and corporations are never going to be your friends. And they don't see you as a friend, they see you as dollars. And the component to taking advantage of that when it's there means keeping your guard up when you see it starting to go away. It doesn't mean that you have to be a sourpuss about it when you see like the display at fucking Walmart and say, oh hey, a pride towel, that makes me feel marginally accepted in the world, if it does. It just means don't let it cloud your judgment, I guess. I don't know that I, as a straight person, get to have a judgment about that one way or another. But if I did, it would probably sound like that.
Look, the most glorious rainbow ever.
Tell me on it.
Just say the word and they are yours.
Because you don't know when stuff like that's going to go away. You don't know when the popular culture is going to decide, you know what, we don't need to pretend to be your friend anymore. We think that we need to make the assholes feel good about themselves now instead. For some reason. And if that sounds a little doomy, I don't want to sound doomy. One, I don't think it's my business to sound doomy. I don't think it's my business to sound doomy as someone who is not going to be as affected by any of this as some others. And I don't do false hope, but I also don't do unrealistic doom.
Tonight at 11.
Doom!
And what I can say is that remembering what I can and knowing what I know of the history of this, I don't know that the kind of erasure that happened of the real history of popular culture from the disco implosion is possible in this quote-unquote anti-woke moment, if there is indeed that kind of moment, simply because of the internet age.
Internet age?
And I am not someone who is an evangelist of, oh, the internet will save us because it stores information and because it's the global town squares. I am the most cynical person about this bullshit machine that is the internet. Very little good that it was supposed to do has been done, and most of the predictions about it have been false. But what it has allowed is connection, and for it to be very difficult to forget many things. And I don't know what the attempted erasure of what recent pop culture has been versus what the so-called anti-woke movement wants future pop culture to look like. I don't know that that kind of undoing is possible, or what it looks like now. After the disco implosion into the 1980s, it very much was possible to basically erase how diverse, how queer, how whatever you want to call the late 70s into the early 80s popular culture was. It wasn't just in a handful of art house films that only a few people in New York and LA saw. There was an episode of All in the Family, which, yes, highly politicized show, but also the most popular fucking show on TV. One of Archie Bunker's friends, Archie's buddy, the whole plot of the episode was that Meathead, Rob Reiner's character, was convinced that Archie's buddy was gay. And Archie was sure that he wasn't. And the payoff to the episode was the guy just going, you know, Archie, he's right.
Oh, Steve, you're going to want to bust him wide open when I tell you this. I don't know where he gets these brainstorms, but he thinks that you're the... I can't even say it, you Steve.
He's right, Arch.
Huh?
He's right.
There was a transgender character on The Jeffersons. And again, a late 70s show, but like it was a storyline that happened. It was handled decently. The Love Boat, a 70s show that ran for a decade. The episode in question was in the 80s, but this was a 70s show, had a transgender storyline.
Excuse me, sir, what do you mean by these kinds of people?
You know. Different.
What do you mean by different? She is the same person.
Oh, come on, Gopher, really?
She is. Except that she probably has more guts than both you and I combined. I mean, do you have any idea what she probably had to go through before she even reached the decision she did? The strings of doctors and the tests that you have to take and who knows what else? Not to mention the pure physical and emotional pain of the whole thing. This takes courage.
You really sound as if you admire her.
I do.
That scene is from an episode that first aired in 1982. The Love Boat itself began airing in 1977. It was family-friendly Saturday night ABC programming. Mildly corny comfort TV for older viewers not out on the town mostly. Imagine that dialogue on a network drama now. That All in the Family episode, that was from 1971. Modern media is a landscape of cowards in many respects. There was a moment of several years where there were frequent gay characters in movies, transgender characters in movies. They were not called transgender characters back then, and a lot of the language around it was not what we would call great today, but they existed. From the late 70s to the early 80s, you saw highly politicized stories about black characters, Latino characters. Go back and watch any random episode of urban set television sitcoms, dramas, cop shows, whatever. Not all of them are going to be perfect. A lot of them are probably going to offend modern sensibilities. Compare them to how safe popular culture became into the early 80s. The Erasure moment didn't really last either, by the way. Well into the mid to late 80s, culture swung back, pivoted back. I'm not a fan of pendulum narratives again, because sometimes things just change.
The truth lies somewhere in between.
Point is, there was a moment where popular culture was very much one way, and the slate tried to wipe itself because, to an extent, mainstream middle-class America thought it had had enough. And it kind of worked. For a short time, but it kind of worked. We really did, in the early to mid-80s, dial ourselves back to a version of the 50s in at least popular culture. I don't know that you can actually do that now. I think that there's people that want to try. I don't think they can. There was a whole book, even there's a famous book by Susan Flutie called Backlash, about the fact that even in outside of popular culture, in actual office culture, in entertainment culture, pop culture, there was an active attempt to undo the strides of feminism, to undo women in the workplace, to undo this and how it translated from both real life work culture and also movies and television depictions of professional women, some of which were not thought of as anti-feminist, but that she felt were.
We now return to busy business lady whose life is missing something, but she doesn't realize it because she's so busy with business.
I've got a lunch meeting and then a meeting after lunch. After that...
Shh. Over the next 90 minutes, I'd like to show you that all your problems can be solved by my penis.
This was a controversial book at the time that was a bestseller and widely read. A lot of it's very dated, but you can find this book and read it. It's very interesting as a time capsule of the moment. The thing is, even back then, this was, pre-internet, you could simply just no longer have things on TV, no longer have things on bookshelves, no longer talk about subjects on the news, and it would go away unless you were in university or in academia and had access to what we would now call a content library. Now, Internet Archive, YouTube, web in general, I don't know that kind of erasure can really be as strong. It's a different fight.
Instead of one big shot controlling all the media, now there's 1,000 freaks Xeroxing their worthless opinions.
I won't tell you that that's why you should have hope, but I think it's a reason to have hope. That it is much harder to erase you if you are someone who is part of a community or a culture or a mindset, that these fucking people who are on this anti-wokeness kick, if you're someone or part of a community that they would like to see erased, or even if you're just a fan of types of entertainment, genres of music, art that would be part of this kind of erasure, it was not ultimately able to be fully erased before. And the tools to prevent that erasure are much more in your hands now than they used to be. And if there's a reason to have hope now, I think that that's that. I think that that would be it. That would be the reason. I'm Bob, and I don't know if that's the big picture this time, but I hope it is a coherent picture. Good luck out there.